Wyoming Territory, 1872. The Dust in Redemption's Fork was a character unto itself. It was an ancient, knowing dust, ground from stone and bone and the endless passage of seasons. It swirled in golden phantoms down the single, rutted main street, settled on the false fronts of the general store and the saloon, and coated the soul of any man who stayed too long. Caleb Blackwood had stayed too long. He knew the dust's taste, its grit between his teeth, the way it clung to his clothes like a second skin. It was the taste of solitude. From the porch of his isolated ranch house, miles from the paltry collection of buildings that constituted the town, the world was a canvas of immense and lonely beauty. The Laramie Mountains clawed at the western sky, their peaks a jagged promise of winter even in the high summer heat. Below them, rolling plains of sage and buffalo grass stretched into an infinity of muted green and silver. Caleb's world was this land, this silence, this carefully constructed emptiness. He had built walls not of timber and stone, but of routine and distance. It served him well. His days were measured by the sun's arc. He rose before dawn, the chill of the high desert night still clinging to the air, and his first task was always the same. Coffee, black and bitter, brewed over the stove. Then came the chores, mending fences that the wind and wandering herds seemed determined to undo, tending to his small herd of hardy cattle, chopping wood, his axe falling with a metronomic rhythm that was the only music he allowed himself. Each task was a bulwark against memory, a physical exhaustion to ward off the emotional kind. He had come here 5 years before, a man hollowed out by grief. The war had taken a piece of him, but the fever that followed had taken everything else. Sarah, and little Thomas, his son, whose laughter was a ghost that sometimes echoed in the whisper of the wind through the pines. He had sold their farm back in Ohio, a place choked with memories, and had ridden west until the past was a faint haze on the eastern horizon. He had bought this land because it was empty, because it demanded everything of a man and offered nothing in return but the stark reality of survival. It suited the barren landscape of his heart. Attachment, he had learned with brutal finality, was a vulnerability. Love was a thread that, once snapped, could unravel a man completely. Here, there were no threads. There was only the land, the work, and the silence. The townsfolk in Redemption's Fork knew him as a quiet, capable man. They respected his privacy. Sheriff Brody would share a nod with him when he came for supplies. Martha, who ran the boarding house, would sometimes try to press a warm pie into his hands, her eyes full of a sympathy he did not want. He accepted their distant courtesies but offered nothing of himself in return. His heart was a fortress, and he was its sole vigilant guard. On this particular afternoon, the sun beat down with a merciless intensity, bleaching the color from the sky. Caleb was replacing a warped board on his porch, the rhythmic rasp of his plane the only sound besides the buzz of a persistent horsefly. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands calloused and sure. His focus was absolute, a deliberate narrowing of his world to the grain of the wood, the curl of the shaving, the satisfying fit of a well-planed edge. It was a state he cultivated, a form of meditation that kept the ghosts at bay. Then a sound pierced the stillness. Faint at first, a mournful cry that drifted on the wind from the east. It was the whistle of the twice-weekly train, a sound that rarely registered in his consciousness. It was a part of the world beyond his fence line, a world of arrivals and departures, of comings and goings that had nothing to do with him. It was a reminder of the connections he had forsaken. Usually, he would have ignored it, letting the sound fade back into the vast silence from which it came. But today, for a reason he could not name, the sound snagged on something inside him. He paused, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the plain. He straightened his back, the muscles protesting, and looked east toward the distant gap in the hills where the iron tracks ran. The whistle blew again, closer this time, a lonely, searching sound that seemed to speak directly to the hollow space inside his chest. It was a disruption, a crack in the placid surface of his solitude. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a disquiet, that was almost like anticipation, and he did not like it at all. He shook his head, a gesture of self-reproach, and bent back to his work, the rasp of the plane a desperate attempt to drown out the lingering echo of the world rushing in. The train slowed with a great sigh of steam and a shriek of metal on metal, its arrival an assault on the sleepy quiet of Redemption's Fork. Dust and cinders billowed from beneath its iron wheels, momentarily obscuring the view from the station platform. Silas, the station master, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles etched by 70 years of Wyoming sun, squinted against the glare. He adjusted his spectacles and consulted the tarnished pocket watch that had been his father's. On time for change. When the steam cleared, the door to the passenger car slid open. A few weary-looking prospectors descended, their faces grim with either disappointment or the grim determination of the hopeful. A salesman in a dusty bowler hat followed, his sample case looking comically out of place. And then she appeared. She stood framed in the doorway for a moment, a figure of such stark contrast to her surroundings that it was as if she had been painted onto the scene from a different world. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, a deep blue that seemed to drink in the harsh sunlight. It was travel-worn, the hem smudged with dust, but its fine tailoring spoke of eastern cities, of gas lamps and paved streets. Her hair, the color of spun honey, was pinned in an elegant arrangement that had begun to come undone, soft tendrils framing a face that was pale with exhaustion but held a determined set to her jaw. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, scanned the platform with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Caleb saw her from across the street, where he was loading sacks of flour into his wagon. He had finished his work on the porch and ridden into town for supplies, a trip he made no more than twice a month. He had been about to leave, eager to return to the predictable solitude of his ranch, when the train's whistle had held him in place. Now he knew why. He watched her, a knot tightening in his gut. She was like a canary in a coal mine, too delicate, too bright for this harsh, monochrome world. Alara Vance took a deep breath, the air hot and gritty in her lungs. It smelled of dust and coal smoke, and something wild and pine-scented that was entirely foreign to her. After 4 days on the train from Philadelphia, every bone in her body ached. But she pushed the weariness aside, her gaze sweeping the small crowd on the platform. She was looking for a Mr. Jasper Croft, the man her late father's business associate had assured her was a respectable and prosperous landowner, a man who would be her husband. Her stomach fluttered with a nervous energy. This was it, the start of her new life. She scanned the faces, weather-beaten, bearded, curious, but none of them stepped forward with a look of recognition. The last of the passengers had disembarked. The conductor began loading mail sacks. A sense of unease, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She descended the steep steps, clutching her small reticule, her other hand holding her skirts away from the grimy platform. Her large trunk was unloaded with a heavy thud beside her. Still, no one approached. Caleb watched the scene unfold with a detached sense of grim inevitability. He had seen it before. Hopeful newcomers arriving with dreams that shattered like glass against the hard reality of the frontier. He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes, then the dawning anxiety as she stood alone beside her luggage, a solitary island of blue in a sea of brown dust. The train gave a final, preparatory hiss of steam. Silas, the station master, approached her, his expression kind but concerned. "Are you expecting someone, miss?" Silas asked, his voice a gentle rumble. "Yes, I am," Alara replied, her voice clearer and stronger than Caleb had expected. "A Mr. Jasper Croft. He was to meet me." Silas's kindly expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He rubbed his grizzled jaw. "Jasper Croft, you say? Can't say I know the name. And I know near everyone in these parts." The cold prick of unease bloomed into full-blown fear in Alara's chest. "But that cannot be. He owns land near here. The Whispering Creek parcel." "Whispering Creek is north of here," Silas said slowly. "Belongs to the Blackwood Ranch. That's Caleb's place." He gestured with his thumb toward the street, where Caleb stood frozen by his wagon, knowing he had been seen. Their eyes met for a brief, startling moment across the dusty expanse. His were the color of a winter sky, gray and guarded. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning back to his wagon, pretending to adjust a harness. He wanted no part of this. The train's whistle shrieked, a final, deafening blast. With a lurch and a groan of coupling cars, it began to pull away from the station, gathering speed, its clatter fading into the distance. It was leaving her behind. The sound was one of utter finality. Alara stood on the empty platform, the dust settling around her, a profound and terrifying sense of abandonment washing over her. She was alone, thousands of miles from everything she had ever known, stranded in a place that felt more like the surface of the moon than any part of America she had ever imagined. Caleb cursed under his breath. He had seen the look on her face when the train pulled away. The carefully constructed composure had crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked panic. He told himself to get in his wagon and leave. It was not his concern. He had his own life, his own ghosts. He had no room for the troubles of a misplaced lady from the East. He gripped the edge of the wagon bed, his knuckles white, but he could still feel the weight of her gaze from a moment before, the silent, desperate question in it. And he remembered another woman, another time, her face pale with fever, her eyes pleading for a miracle he could not provide. The memory was a spur in his side, sharp and insistent. With another curse, this one directed at himself and his own weakness, he turned from his wagon and started across the street. His steps were heavy, reluctant. Each one felt like a betrayal of the vow he had made to himself years ago. Do not get involved. Do not care. But the image of her standing alone, so profoundly out of place, was a hook he could not shake. As he approached, Alara was trying to gather herself. She would not cry. She was the daughter of a man who had built a shipping empire from nothing. She had his strength in her veins. She bent down to lift her heavy trunk, determined to drag it to the hotel. Surely there was a hotel, and figure out her next step. The trunk was heavier than it looked. As she heaved, her foot slipped on the uneven planking of the platform. She gave a small cry as she lost her balance, stumbling backward, her arms flailing. Suddenly, strong hands gripped her upper arms, steadying her. The world, which had tilted precariously, righted itself. She found herself pressed against a solid wall of a chest, the scent of leather, pine, and clean sweat filling her senses. She looked up into the face of the man from across the street. He was taller than she had realized, his shoulders broad beneath a simple cotton shirt. His face was lean and weathered, his jaw set in a hard line, but his eyes, those gray eyes, held a flicker of something that was not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. "Careful there," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges like he did not use it often. The contact was electric, a shock of warmth and strength that coursed through her. For a moment, she could not speak, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was acutely aware of his hands on her arms, the sheer physical reality of him holding her up, keeping her from falling. It was the first human touch she had felt that was not the impersonal jostling of the train, and it was both terrifying and deeply comforting. He had created an immediate, unwilling intimacy in the middle of her disaster. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled back, and he released her instantly, taking a half step away as if her touch had burned him. The space between them now felt charged, empty. "That trunk looks heavy," Caleb stated, his gaze fixed on the offending object. It was a practical observation, a safe harbor from the storm of her disarray. "It is," she admitted, finding her voice again. I need to find a hotel." "There's no hotel," he said flatly. "Just Martha's boarding house. And she's likely full up with surveyors this time of year." He was not trying to be cruel, just truthful. This was a place that did not soften its edges for anyone. The last of her hope seemed to wither under the relentless sun. "No hotel. No Mr. Croft. No way back until the next train in 3 days." Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, and this time she could not stop them from welling up. She turned her head away, mortified to be seen crying in front of this stern, intimidating stranger. Caleb saw the sheen of tears in her eyes before she turned away. It did something to the fortress around his heart. A single, well-aimed stone against a crumbling wall. He let out a long, slow breath, resigning himself to the inevitable. He could not leave her here. He just could not. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I'll take the trunk. We'll go see Martha. We'll figure something out." Without waiting for her reply, he bent down, lifted the heavy trunk with an easy grunt of effort, and swung it onto his shoulder. He started walking toward his wagon, leaving her no choice but to follow. Martha's boarding house was a 2-story timber frame building, cleaner and better maintained than any other structure on the main street. Geraniums spilled from window boxes, a defiant splash of red against the universal brown. The front room served as a dining hall, and the scent of roasting chicken and baking bread hung in the air, a warm and welcoming aroma that made Alara's stomach clench with hunger. Martha herself was a woman in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She was wiping down a long communal table when Caleb entered, Alara trailing hesitantly behind him. "Caleb Blackwood," Martha said, her voice a mixture of surprise and approval. "Didn't expect to see you twice in 1 month. And who is this?" Her sharp eyes took in Alara from head to toe, noting the fine dress, the exhausted pallor, and the tear-streaked dust on her cheeks. "This is Miss Vance," Caleb said, setting the trunk down by the door. "She's run into some trouble. Was supposed to be met off the train, but her party wasn't there. She needs a room." Martha's gaze softened as she looked at Alara again. She had seen this story before, too. "I'm full, Caleb. The surveyors from Union Pacific took my last 2 rooms this morning. There's not a spare bed in the house." Alara's heart sank. She felt a wave of dizziness, the combined effect of hunger, exhaustion, and despair. She reached out a hand to steady herself against the doorframe. "She can't stay in the saloon," Caleb said, his voice low and firm, a protective edge to it that surprised even him. "And there's nowhere else." Martha looked from Caleb's resolute face to Alara's pale one. She clucked her tongue. "Well, she certainly can't sleep on the street. There's the old storage room upstairs. It's small, just a cot, really, but it's clean and it has a lock on the door. It'll have to do until we can sort this out." Relief washed over Alara, so powerfully her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she breathed, looking at the older woman with profound gratitude. "Thank you so much, madam. It's Martha," the woman corrected gently. "Now, you look like you're about to faint. You come sit down. I'll get you a plate of chicken and some water." She bustled Alara toward the table, seating her as if she were a fragile doll. Caleb remained by the door, feeling awkward and out of place in the warm, domestic space. His job was done. He had delivered her to a safe place. He could leave now, retreat back to his fortress of solitude. He turned to go. "You'll stay for supper, Caleb," Martha called out, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's the least you can do. And I want to hear what kind of scoundrel leave the young lady stranded at our station." Caleb hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to make his excuses and flee. Eating a meal here, with them, felt like a dangerous step onto unfamiliar ground. But he looked at Alara, who was watching him with those wide, green eyes, a silent plea in them. He thought of the cold dinner of jerky and hardtack waiting for him back at the ranch. He gave a single, reluctant nod. "All right, Martha." For a little while, the meal was a quiet affair. Alara ate with a ravenous hunger she was too tired to be embarrassed by. The roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh-baked bread were the most delicious things she had ever tasted. Caleb ate slowly, methodically, his gaze mostly fixed on his plate. Martha, however, was not one for silence. "So, this Mr. Croft," she began, fixing Alara with a pointed look. "What did you know of him?" Alara swallowed a mouthful of potatoes. She felt a flush of shame, realizing how foolish she must sound. "Very little, I'm afraid. The arrangement was made for me. My father passed away last year. His business partner, a man I trusted, said that Mr. Croft was a man of good standing. He said this was a fine opportunity for me to start a new life." She omitted the part about the crippling debts her father had left behind, the fact that this marriage was less an opportunity and more a desperate necessity. And he was to marry you, sight unseen? Martha asked, her brow furrowed. Yes, Elara confirmed, her voice small. Caleb listened, a muscle working in his jaw. He knew men like the one she described. Men who saw the West not as a place to build a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. And women like Miss Vance were often just another commodity to them. The name Croft still meant nothing to him, but the story smelled foul. Did he mention any land? Caleb asked suddenly, his first direct question. Elara looked at him, surprised by his interjection. Yes, the Whispering Creek parcel. It was to be part of my dowry. My father had purchased it years ago as an investment. Caleb put his fork down. The pieces clicked into place with a cold, hard snap. Whispering Creek runs through the northern edge of my property. It's the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction during the dry season. There's no separate parcel. It's all Blackwood land. Been in my family since the treaty. The room went silent. The implications of his words hung in the air. Elara stared at him, her face draining of all color. But I have the deed. You have a piece of paper, Caleb corrected, his tone grim. Someone sold your father a worthless claim, or a fraudulent one. And this Croft character, whoever he is, knew it. He wasn't after a wife, Miss Vance. He was after your signature on a quitclaim deed, likely to try and use it to challenge my water rights. The truth of it was as stark and ugly as the landscape outside. She had not been courted. She had been lured. She was not a prospective bride. She was a pawn in a scheme she did not understand. The carefully constructed hope she had clung to for weeks crumbled into dust. She pressed her lips together, fighting another wave of tears. This time, they were tears of anger and humiliation. I see, she said, her voice tight. She rose from the table, her back ramrod straight. Thank you for the meal, Martha, and for your help, Mr. Blackwood. If you will excuse me, I am very tired. She turned and walked toward the stairs, her head held high, a solitary figure of wounded pride. Caleb watched her go, a bitter taste in his mouth. He had given her the truth, but it felt like he had struck her. He should have been gentler, but he did not know how to be gentle anymore. You're a hard man, Caleb Blackwood, Martha said quietly after Elara had disappeared up the stairs. But you did the right thing telling her. Better she knows the kind of viper she was dealing with. She doesn't belong here, Caleb said, more to himself than to Martha. She should take the next train back east where she'll be safe and go back to what? Martha countered, her gaze sharp. Girls like her, alone and with no family, don't have an easy time of it anywhere. Maybe she's stronger than you think. Maybe all she needs is a chance. Caleb said nothing. He pushed his chair back and stood up. I'd best be getting back. Thank you for the supper. He walked to the door, his solitude calling to him. But as he stepped out into the cool, star-dusted night, he could not shake the image of Elara's face, the shock, the hurt, and then the flash of defiant strength. Martha was right. He had been too hard, and for the first time in a very long time, he found himself wishing he knew how to be otherwise. The cot in the small storage room was surprisingly comfortable, but Elara could not sleep. The events of the day churned in her mind, a maelstrom of confusion and fear. She had been so naive. She had trusted in the legacy of her father's good name, in the decency of men. That trust now lay in ruins. Mr. Blackwood's blunt assessment of her situation had been brutal, but it had also been clarifying. She was not a victim of misfortune. She had been the target of a deliberate deception. A strange sense of calm began to settle over her. The worst had happened. She was stranded and penniless, her hopes for a secure future dashed. And yet, she was still here. She was alive. The sun would rise tomorrow. She thought of her father, a man who had faced bankruptcy twice and rebuilt his fortune each time. He had never surrendered to despair. Neither would she. She rose from the cot and went to the small window, looking out over the dark, silent street. The moon was a silver sliver in the inky sky, casting long shadows that made the familiar shapes of the buildings seem alien and menacing. She thought of Caleb Blackwood. He was a difficult, guarded man, as harsh and unyielding as the land itself. But he had helped her. He had not turned away, as he so clearly had wanted to. There was a core of honor in him, buried deep beneath layers of bitterness or grief. She had seen in the way he stood up to Martha on her behalf, and in the reluctant concern in his eyes. She had 3 days until the next train. 3 days to figure out what to do. Going back to Philadelphia was not an option. There was nothing for her there but debt and pity. She had to find work. She could teach, or sew, or cook. She was not helpless. This place, this redemption's fork, was as daunting as anything she had ever imagined, but it was also a blank slate. Perhaps, she thought, a new life did not have to be the one that was planned for you. Perhaps it was the one you forged for yourself out of the ashes of your disappointment. With that thought, a flicker of her old determination returned. She would not be defeated. 2 days later, Alara had established a routine. She helped Martha with chores around the boarding house in exchange for her room and board. She swept floors, kneaded dough, and peeled potatoes, her soft hands quickly becoming chapped and sore. But the physical work was grounding, a welcome distraction from her anxieties. She learned the names of the townspeople, the taciturn Sheriff Brody, the gossipy wife of the general store owner, the quiet blacksmith with sad eyes. They were wary of her, this strange woman from the East, but Martha's protection gave her a measure of acceptance. She did not see Caleb Blackwood again. She told herself she was glad. His presence was unsettling, a constant reminder of her foolishness. And yet, she found herself glancing up the street whenever a horse and rider approached, a small, involuntary flutter of disappointment in her chest when it was not him. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the boarding house when 2 men stepped out of the alley. They were not from the town. They had the hard, watchful eyes of men who lived by their wits and their guns. One was tall and thin, with a cruel twist to his mouth. The other was shorter, built like a barrel, his face obscured by a thick, unkempt beard. "You be Miss Vance," the tall one said. It was not a question. Alara's heart began to beat faster. She clutched a damp bedsheet in her hand like a shield. "I am. Who are you?" "Friends of Jasper Croft," the man said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "He was unavoidably detained. Sent us to conclude his business with you. He needs you to sign a paper. For the land, so..." Caleb had been right. This was what it was all about. "I will not be signing anything," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Your Mr. Croft is a fraud. The deed he seeks is worthless." The man, who she would later learn was named Finn, chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Worthless to you, maybe, but not to our employer. Now, you can do this easy, or you can do this hard. We just need your signature." He took a step closer. "Get away from me," she said, backing away until she was pressed against the clothesline. "I don't think so," Finn said, reaching for her. "Leave the lady alone." The voice came from the end of the alley. It was low, cold, and carried an unmistakable threat. Both men spun around. Caleb Blackwood stood there, his duster pushed back to reveal the worn leather holster on his hip. He had not planned to come back to town before his next supply run, but a nagging unease about the woman, about the fraudulent deed, had gnawed at him for 2 days. He had told himself he was just checking on a loose property claim, but he knew he was lying. He had come back for her. Finn's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your concern. Rancher, you're on my side of the street," Caleb said calmly. "That makes it my concern. Now, I'm going to tell you one time to turn around and ride out of this town." The barrel-chested man's hand drifted toward his pistol. In a movement so fast, it was almost a blur. Caleb's own gun was in his hand, cocked and leveled. "I wouldn't," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "I'm a patient man, but my patience just ran out." The 2 thugs exchanged a look. They were hired muscle, not fools looking to die. They saw the cold certainty in Caleb's eyes and knew he was not bluffing. Finn spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled. Then he and his partner backed away slowly, disappearing back into the alley. Caleb kept his gun trained on the alley for a long moment before he finally holstered it. He turned to Alara. She was still pressed against the clothesline, her face as white as the sheet she was clutching. Her eyes were wide with shock and a dawning gratitude. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with the fading adrenaline. She nodded, unable to speak. She took a shaky breath, then another. They said they were from Mr. Croft. I figured, Caleb said grimly. They won't be the last. A man who wants those water rights won't give up easy. You're not safe here. Not in town. The illusion of safety she had built over the past 2 days shattered. The town was small, exposed. Martha was a kind woman, but she was no match for men like that. There was nowhere to go. Caleb saw the renewed fear in her eyes. The decision formed in his mind before he had even consciously considered it. It was a reckless, foolish idea, one that went against every rule he had lived by for the past 5 years. But it was the only thing he could think of to do. You'll come with me, he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. To my ranch. It's isolated. I can defend it better than you can be defended here. You can stay there until we figure out how to get you out of this territory for good. He was offering her shelter, a sanctuary within his own fortress of solitude. He was inviting the world in, and he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that nothing would ever be the same. The ride to the ranch was long and silent. Alara sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, clutching a small bag with her essential belongings. Martha had been surprisingly supportive of the plan, her only condition being that Caleb send for her to come and stay as a chaperone as soon as he could. It's for the best, dearie, she had told Alara. He's a good man, under all that granite. He'll keep you safe. As they left the last vestiges of the town behind, the vastness of the landscape enveloped them. The sky was an endless, aching blue, the silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. Alara looked at the man beside her. His profile was stark against the horizon, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. He had not spoken a word since they had left. She felt a strange mix of fear and a burgeoning trust. She was placing her life entirely in the hands of this stranger, a man who seemed as wild and untamed as the country itself. Caleb was acutely aware of her presence beside him. It was a disruption to the familiar solitude of his journeys. He could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender soap that clung to her, a stark contrast to the dust and sagebrush he was used to. He could feel the slight warmth of her body, even though they were not touching. He had invited a complication into his life, a soft, fragile thing that he now had to protect. He told himself it was a matter of duty, of honor. A man did not stand by and let predators harm the innocent. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had seen the terror in her eyes in that alley, and his immediate, violent reaction had been more than just a sense of civic duty. It had been personal. When they finally crested a rise and she saw the ranch for the first time, Alara drew in a sharp breath. It was nestled in a shallow valley, a simple but sturdy-looking log house with a wide porch, a large barn, and a series of corrals. A small creek, Whispering Creek, she presumed, gurgled nearby, its banks lined with cottonwood trees that were a vibrant green against the muted tones of the surrounding plains. It was isolated, yes, but did not feel desolate. It felt like a refuge. It felt like a home. This is it, Caleb said, breaking the long silence. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand briefly closing over hers. The touch was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt through her all the same. He showed her inside. The house was Spartan, functional, and immaculately clean. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A small kitchen area was tucked into one corner. Everything was handmade, sturdy, and bore the marks of its creator. "You can take the bedroom," he said, gesturing to a closed door. "I'll sleep out here by the fire, Mr. Blackwood. I cannot possibly take your bed," she protested. "It's Caleb," he said, his voice firm. "And you will. It's safer. The bedroom has only one small window. This room has 2 doors and 3 windows. I can watch the approaches better from out here." His reasoning was purely practical, but it was also an act of chivalry that did not escape her notice. That evening, they sat at the small table and ate a meal of beans and salted pork that Caleb had cooked. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the awkward silence of strangers, but a more companionable quiet, filled with unspoken thoughts. Alara looked around the room. at the neatly stacked firewood, the clean-swept floor, the worn leather-bound books on a shelf by the fireplace. "You built all of this yourself?" she asked softly. Caleb nodded, not looking up from his plate. "Most of it's a fine home," she said. "It feels peaceful." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were clouded with a shadow of pain so deep it made her ache for him. "It was meant to be," he said, his voice barely audible. The opening was there, a crack in his formidable armor. She took a chance, her voice gentle. "Were you not always alone here, Caleb?" He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he would not answer. He stared into the fire he had lit against the evening chill, its flames dancing in his gray eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed grief. "No, I wasn't always alone," he told her then, the words coming out in a halting, painful rush, as if he were pulling them from a wound that had never healed. He told her about Sarah, his wife, a woman who had loved this harsh land as much as he did. He told her about their son, Thomas, a boy with his mother's laugh and a love for horses. He told her about the fever that had swept through their valley 3 winters ago, swift and merciless. He had been away, caught in a blizzard while trying to bring back a doctor from a town 2 days right away. By the time he had made it back, it was too late. He had buried them himself, on the hill overlooking the creek. "I built this house for them," he finished, his voice raw. After they were gone, the silence, it was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. "I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I didn't let anyone else in, I could just endure it. I thought attachment was the thing that broke you." Tears streamed down Alara's face as she listened. She did not try to wipe them away. His grief was a vast, desolate landscape, and she felt like a trespasser, but one who had been invited in. When he fell silent, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His hand was calloused and hard, but it trembled slightly beneath hers. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she whispered. No one should have to endure such a loss. He did not pull his hand away. He just stared at their joined hands as if he had never seen such a thing before. After a moment, she felt his fingers curl slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible response. "My parents are gone too," she found herself saying, the confession a quiet offering in return for his. "My mother, when I was a girl, and my father, last year." His heart just gave out. He had worked so hard his whole life, and, in the end, it was for nothing. He left behind a mountain of debt. "That's why I came out here. This marriage, it was my only option. I was alone, too, in that small, firelit room, miles from anywhere. 2 solitary souls shared their broken pieces. It was not a cure, but it was a balm, a shared vulnerability that forged the first true bond between them. They were no longer just a protector and his charge. They were 2 people who understood the shape of each other's loneliness. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Caleb taught Alara to shoot a rifle, his hands gently correcting her stance, his proximity sending a cascade of shivers down her spine. "You need to know how to protect yourself," he had said, his tone practical, but his touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. She proved to be a quick study, her determination impressing him. She was not the fragile canary he had first thought. There was a core of steel in her. In return, she brought a softness to his harsh world. She found a patch of earth by the creek and began to cultivate a small garden. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She read to him in the evenings from the books on his shelf, Shakespeare and the poetry of Byron, her voice a soothing melody against the crackle of the fire. She filled the silence he had so carefully cultivated, not with noise, but with a quiet sense of life that he had not realized how much he missed. He found himself watching her, the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, the way she would bite her lip in concentration when she was weeding the garden, the genuine warmth of her smile when he brought in a bucket of fresh milk. The walls around his heart, so diligently maintained, were beginning to crumble, brick by painful brick. He was starting to feel again, and it terrified him. One afternoon, as she was returning from the creek with a bucket of water, a rattlesnake, startled from its sunning spot on a rock, coiled and struck. Alara cried out more in surprise than fear, dropping the bucket and stumbling backward. Caleb was out of the barn in an instant, a shovel in his hand. With two swift, brutal movements, he dispatched the snake. He rushed to her side, his face pale with a fear he could not hide. "Did it get you? Are you bit?" he demanded, his hands scanning her arms and legs. "No, I'm fine," she gasped, her heart hammering. It missed. He pulled her into his arms then, a rough, desperate embrace that crushed the air from her lungs. He held her tight against his chest, his face buried in her hair, his body trembling with the force of his relief. "God, Elara!" The vulnerability was shuttered, the walls slamming back into place. He dropped his hands and took a step back, the distance between them once again a chasm. "You need to be more careful," he said, his voice clipped and harsh. "This land doesn't forgive mistakes." He turned without another word and stalked back toward the barn, leaving her standing by the creek, her heart aching with a confusion and disappointment, so keen it was a physical pain. The incident with the snake changed everything. The comfortable companionship they had built was replaced by a tense, strained silence. Caleb became more distant than ever, his words clipped, his gaze averted. He threw himself into his work with a renewed, desperate energy, as if he could physically exhaust his feelings for her. He was running scared, and Elara knew it. He had allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, a moment of connection, and it had terrified him. He was trying to push her away, to rebuild the fortress that she had so effortlessly breached. He began talking about getting her out of the territory again. Sheriff Brody sent word. He said one evening, his eyes fixed on a point over her shoulder. "There's a family heading east on a wagon train in a week. They've agreed to take you with them. It's the safest way." Each word was a hammer blow to her heart. He was getting rid of her. After everything they had shared, after that moment of raw emotion by the creek, he was sending her away. The anger and hurt were so potent she could taste them. "And that is what you want?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "For me to just leave?" "It's what's best," he said, his voice flat. "You don't belong here, Elara. You belong back east, where there are no snakes and no men like Finn. You deserve a safe, civilized life, and you get to decide what I deserve," she shot back, her temper flaring. "You get to decide what is best for me? Have you even once asked me what I want?" "It doesn't matter what you want," he snapped, his control finally breaking. He stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "This is not a life for you. Don't you understand? I can't protect you forever. What happens when I'm not here? What happens when Croft sends more men who are more determined? I won't. I can't lose someone else. I can't go through that again." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. It was not about her safety, not really. It was about his fear, his terror of letting her into his heart, only to have her torn away from him like Sarah and Thomas had been. He was pushing her away not for her own good, but for his. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a profound sadness. "So you would send me away because you were afraid?" she asked softly. "You would make this choice for both of us, out of fear? I thought you were a brave man, Caleb Blackwood. But you are a coward." His face hardened, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "Think what you will," he said, his voice cold as stone. "You leave in 1 week." He turned and strode out of the house, slamming the door behind him, leaving her alone in the crushing silence. The week that followed was the longest of Elara's life. They moved around each other like ghosts, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved pain. Elara packed her meager belongings, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had been a fool to think this could be a home, to think that the connection she felt with this broken man could ever be enough to heal him. On the final night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled around the small house, and rain lashed against the window panes. It was a fitting soundtrack to the tempest in her heart. She sat by the fire, unable to sleep, watching the flames and thinking about the journey that awaited her in the morning. A journey back to a life she no longer wanted. Caleb stood on the porch, staring out into the churning darkness. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside him. Her words had cut him to the quick. A coward. Was she right? Was he sacrificing a chance at happiness, a chance at life, because he was too afraid to risk his heart again? He thought of the empty years ahead, The return to the crushing silence, a silence that would now be filled with the ghost of her laughter, the memory of her voice reading poetry by the fire. The thought of it was unendurable. It was a fate worse than any grief he had already known. A sudden, sharp crack of splintering wood from the direction of the barn cut through the howl of the wind. It was not a sound the storm would make. Caleb's head snapped up, every sense on high alert. He drew his pistol from its holster, his body moving on pure instinct. He flattened himself against the wall of the house, his eyes straining to pierce the rain-swept darkness. Another sound, a low, guttural curse, carried on the wind. There were men out there. Fiend. It had to be. They had come back, using the storm for cover. And he had been so lost in his own misery that he had let his guard down. He slipped back inside the house, his movements silent. Alara looked up, her eyes wide with alarm as she saw the gun in his hand. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay down and stay quiet," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "They're here." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. But it was immediately followed by a surge of adrenaline. She would not be a helpless victim. She scrambled to the gun rack on the wall, her hands closing around the heavy rifle he had taught her to use. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. The front door suddenly burst open with a deafening crash, kicked in from the outside. Finn stood there, rain-soaked and grinning, a pistol in his hand. The barrel-chested man was right behind him. "Evening, rancher," Finn sneered. "We came back for the lady." And the deed, Caleb fired without hesitation. His shot went wide as Finn ducked back outside, the bullet thudding into the doorframe. The other man charged into the room, and Caleb met him, tackling him to the floor. They wrestled for control of the man's gun, grunting and cursing, their bodies crashing against the furniture. Alara saw Finn creeping back around the side of the house, heading for the window. She knew he would have a clear shot at Caleb, whose back was turned. There was no time to think. She raised the heavy rifle, just as Caleb had taught her. She braced it against her shoulder, aimed for the window, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's kick was a brutal punch to her shoulder, but the sound of shattering glass and a man's scream of pain was her reward. Finn staggered back from the window, clutching a bleeding arm. The diversion was all Caleb needed. He slammed his opponent's head against the floorboards, dazing him, and wrenched the gun from his hand. He scrambled to his feet just as Finn, enraged, appeared in the broken doorway again. "I'm going to kill you both," he roared, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, Alara acted again. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the hearth and swung it with all her might, connecting with the back of the dazed thug's head as he tried to get up. He collapsed with a groan, out cold. At the same instant, Caleb fired. His shot was true. Finn cried out, clutching his chest, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He staggered backward, falling off the porch and into the mud below. Silence descended, broken only by the roar of the storm and their own ragged breathing. It was over. Caleb rushed to her side, his eyes wild. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands checking her for injuries. "No," she whispered, her body trembling uncontrollably now that the danger had passed. The heavy rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let her go. "Alara," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life. We saved each other," she whispered back, her face pressed against his chest, the steady, frantic beat of his heart a comfort against her cheek. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his gaze intense. The fear, the doubt, the carefully constructed walls. It had all been burned away in the fire of the last few minutes. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth. "I was a fool," he said, his voice cracking. "A coward, just like you said. I was so afraid of losing you that I was going to throw you away. I can't live in that silence anymore, Alara. Not without you. I thought I could live alone. I was wrong. I can't live without you. I love you." The words she had longed to hear, words she thought would never be spoken, filled the space between them. Tears of relief and joy streamed down her face. "Oh, Caleb," she cried softly. "I love you too." He lowered his head and kissed her then. It was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future claimed. It was the kiss of a man coming home after a long and lonely exile. It was the kiss that sealed the end of his solitude and the beginning of their life. When the storm passed and the dawn broke, clear and clean-washed, Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies arrived. Caleb had ridden out to meet them, having tied up the unconscious thug and confirmed Finn was dead. The story came out quickly: the attempted kidnapping, the assault, the self-defense. The deed Alara held was examined and declared a clear forgery. With the thug's confession, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Jasper Croft, who was apprehended in a neighboring town a week later, his land-grabbing scheme in ruins. The town of Redemption's Fork, which had once looked upon Alara with suspicion, now saw her as a heroine. The story of how she had wielded a rifle and a skillet to defend the Blackwood Ranch became an instant local legend. When Caleb and Alara rode into town together a few days later, they were met not with gossip, but with nods of respect and genuine smiles. That afternoon, Caleb took Alara to the small hill overlooking the creek. 2 simple wooden crosses stood beneath the shade of a large cottonwood tree. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind whispering through the grass. "This is Sarah," Caleb said quietly, touching one of the crosses. "And this is Thomas." Alara placed a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked at the base of the markers. "They would be happy for you, Caleb," she said softly. "They would want you to live and to love again." He turned to her, his eyes clear and full of a light she had never seen there before. He took her hands in his. From his pocket, he pulled a small, simple gold band. It was worn with age, but it glowed in the afternoon sun. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice steady. "She gave it to me to give to the woman I knew I could not live without. I was wrong about so many things, Alara. I thought this land was a place to be alone. But it's not. It's a place to build a home. With you. Will you marry me, Alara Vance? Will you build a life with me here?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from the ring to his earnest, hopeful face. This was her home. This was her future. This was the life she had not known she was searching for. "Yes," she whispered, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes, Caleb Blackwood. I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Their wedding was a simple affair, held right on the porch of the ranch house. The whole town came. Martha stood by Alara's side, weeping happily into a lace handkerchief. Sheriff Brody served as Caleb's best man, clapping him on the back with a wide grin. They said their vows as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The community that had once been a collection of strangers now surrounded them, their acceptance and support a warm and welcome embrace. As the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, Caleb looked at Alara, his wife, and knew that the long winter of his heart was finally over. 2 years later, spring had come to the valley with a gentle hand. The cottonwood trees along the creek were dressed in new, vibrant green leaves, and the garden Alara had planted was a riot of color, with tulips and daffodils blooming in cheerful profusion. The ranch house had grown. A new wing had been added, its fresh-cut pine logs smelling sweet in the warm air. The land was prospering, and so were its inhabitants. Alara sat on the porch swing, a soft blanket tucked around her. Her belly was swollen with the promise of their second child. In her arms, she held her son, 1-year-old Samuel, his hair the same honey blonde as hers, but his eyes the same steady, thoughtful gray as his father's. He gurgled happily, his tiny hand gripping her finger. Caleb came up the porch steps, his boots dusty from a long day of mending fences on the north pasture. He moved with a lightness and ease that had been absent when she first met him. The harsh lines on his face had softened, replaced by the gentle crinkles of laughter at the corners of his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her, a tender, familiar gesture that still made her heart flutter. Then he kissed the top of Samuel's head. "How are my 2 most precious treasures?" he asked, his voice a low, contented rumble. "We are well," Alara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as he sat beside her on the swing. "Though this one seems to think my hair is a toy," Caleb chuckled, gently prying Samuel's fingers from Alara's hair. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the swing moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the valley, their valley. It was a scene of such profound peace, a peace they had fought for and built together. She remembered the terrified, desperate woman who had stepped off the train in a dusty, intimidating town. She had come west seeking shelter and had found so much more. She had found her own strength. She had found a home, and she had found a love deeper and truer than any she could have imagined. "Do you ever miss it?" Caleb asked quietly, his gaze on the distant horizon. "Philadelphia? The life you had before?" Alara looked at her husband, at the love shining in his eyes. She looked at the beautiful, sleeping child in her arms and felt the gentle kick of the new life within her. She looked at the sturdy house they had made a home and the vast, beautiful land that had claimed her heart. "No," she said, her voice full of a certainty that was as deep and unshakable as the mountains themselves. "My life did not begin until I came here. You saved my life that day in the alley, Caleb. You saved me from a terrible mistake. Now, let me walk beside you always." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her close. "Always, Alara," he whispered, his heart full. In the quiet dawn of their new life, the drifter had finally found his way home.